anything from me, you can just send me a message through the chat or just say it out loud. I'll hear everything. So if you need something, just holler at me.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I know people are coming in. Appreciate that. It's 6 o'clock right on the button here in the Midwest, located. I'm in Terre Haute, Indiana. So wherever you are, I know Dr. Browning is with us. He's in the Pacific West Coast, where it's only 3 o'clock there. But we are going to get started here in just a couple minutes. We'll give people a couple minutes to hop on. And before we get really started, but wanted to get some kind of generalities out of the way first and foremost, and that is to thank all of you for participating. My name is Troy Fears. I'm the Executive Director of Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center. We are a small Holocaust museum and education center located in Terre Haute, Indiana, which, if you don't know where that's at, it's about an hour directly west of Indianapolis, right on the Illinois-Indiana border in west central Indiana. So we have been a museum for about 25 years, actually 27 years. So excited to be able to put on some programs for you each fall. This is our first one of the fall, so it's always exciting. We have another one coming up on Thursday. We'll talk about that at the end of this session, but we have about an hour tonight, and so we are excited to have Dr. Christopher Browning with us. And anytime that we do a program, whether it be virtual or in person, we have to thank you, our supporters, for doing that. They are free, obviously, sessions for you to watch, but we couldn't do it without your support. So we appreciate that. And you'll be getting an email after this is over, and there's a link on there if you'd like to make a donation to Candles. We would appreciate it. You always hear that doesn't matter how much, a little goes a long way, and that is definitely true in the nonprofit world, and especially the Holocaust Museum world. So I've been with Candles for about a year now, and learn a lot each and every day that I'm there. And so without further ado, I will like to introduce to you tonight's guest speaker. Again, it's Dr. Christopher Browning. He is the Frank Porter Graham Professor of History Emeritus at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's currently located in Tacoma, Washington. He's the author of 8 books, including Ordinary Men, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight. I'm sure most of you have read it or seen it or are reading it. And so we're excited about that. But so Ordinary Men, The Origins of the Final Solution, and Remembering Survival were 3 of his books that received the National Jewish Book Award in the Holocaust category. So an accomplished author. He also has served as an expert witness in war crime trials in Australia, Canada, and Great Britain, as well as in 2 Holocaust denial cases, one in Toronto in 1988 and one in London in the year 2000. So very excited to have Dr. Browning here tonight as part of what we call our Walter Sommers Lecture on Holocaust History. Walter Sommers was a Holocaust survivor who spent many days and years volunteering at Candles Holocaust Museum. So he passed away this past January at 101. So we are excited to have Dr. Browning here for, again, the first of a few programs that we're going to be having this fall. And so without further ado, again, I will turn it over to Dr. Browning. So take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. I am indeed coming from an unusually sunny day in the Pacific Northwest, so the sun coming in my southern window is casting half my face in shadows, and I apologize for that. But in any case, it's a lot better here than oftentimes rain and overcast. In any case, today I wanted to talk about the book Ordinary Men. It is now 30 years old. It was first published in 1992. second and third editions in 1998 and 2017. And I wanted to do that in three parts, to talk a little bit about the origins of the book, how it came about to be written, the challenges involved there. Second, the responses to the book in the 1990s, particularly some critical responses, some of which were more constructive than others, but what helped to, in a sense, launch a debate over a series of questions, what we now call perpetrator studies. That term didn't exist really, I think, until the 1990s. And that some of the issues the book raised, the debates that it raised, the challenges to the book, I think, have been fruitful in advancing scholarship. And then thirdly, talk about some very more recent developments that I think are sort of paving the way for the direction perpetrator studies are taking now. I'd begin by noting that perpetrator studies, in fact, is a fairly broad field because there isn't a single kind of perpetrator. Certainly, we have the ideological leaders at the top, Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, the true believers in Nazi ideology. We have the experts that enabled the Nazis, the officer corps that conquered Europe and the countries where the Jews that Hitler would murder lived, the industrialists and economic experts that gave Germany its fighting machine, officers and people like Albert Speer, most of whom after the war claimed they were simply apolitical experts, but in fact were far more invested in the Nazis and enthusiastic about them at the time than they claimed after 1945. We had a host of what we might call middle managers, people who were the problem solvers on the local level, the middle echelon bureaucracy, civil servants and others that turned Hitler's objectives and general policy into the specific policies that made the final solution so lethal. But the group that at least up until the 90s we knew the least about were what we might call the grassroots killers, the people at the very bottom who actually committed the physical act of killing. Because of course, they didn't leave the same kind of documents behind. Upper echelon people wrote memoranda, they issued reports. Many of them were tried after the war and interrogated. But at the very low level, we didn't have collections of letters, diaries left, certainly not that families eagerly turned over. And most of these people were so utterly anonymous that they certainly weren't investigated and tried after the war. So the grassroots perpetrators, in effect, were the group about which we knew very little other than the impressions, of course, of the victims who were usually didn't know the people who were killing them or had very little contact other than the most spectacular cases of sadism and torture and that sort of thing. So that it was a group that we didn't get much of a handle on. It was my good fortune then that I had an entree into this when I was doing work at the Central Agency for the Investigation of Nazi Crimes in the 1980s. This was an agency located outside Stuttgart in West Germany, and it coordinated the research investigation to locate suspected Nazi criminals and help get cases started so that local prosecutors who didn't know who was living in their area couldn't possibly know, how to even start looking for them, had a central agency that in effect did the preliminary steps for them. And it was in the course of that I was reading every indictment and every judgment related to Poland for another project that I came across the indictment of Reserve Police Battalion 101 and that had been operating in Poland. And it immediately was one of those moments that was kind of a eureka moment for an historian. We spend many years in the archives trudging through file after file of documents, most of which are pretty routine. And every once in a while, we strike gold. We find something that we didn't know would be there, but we were always hoping to find someday in some form. And it was, in the case for me, my eureka moment was this indictment of Reserve Police Battalion 101. Two things in particular caught my attention. I'd always been looking at and researching the issue of choice. What choice did the perpetrators have? And here, framed in the story of Reserve Police Battalion 101, was the speech that Major Trop, the commander of the unit, on the day of his first mass killing, offers his men the opportunity to not take part. For the rank and file, he basically said, if you don't feel up to this, you can step out and excuse yourself. I'd never seen anything like that in any other German document or post-war account of what had happened. So for me, this was just crucial. I was going to have a test case when the standard alibi of virtually every accused Nazi criminal had always been, I was only following orders. I had no choice. If I didn't do as I was told, I would have suffered some draconic punishment. I would have been shot alongside the Jews or something such as that. And here was a case where all of those standard alibis of duress, of coercion, disappeared. And that in this case, we would be able to see what did the men say when they couldn't turn to a alibi of coercion or duress, and that this then would allow me to explore this issue of choice. How much leeway did men have, and what kind of choices did they make, and why did they make those choices? And the second thing that just struck me in this indictment was the extraordinarily vivid descriptions of some of the testimony given by members of the battalion themselves. In almost all the court records, and I looked through hundreds and hundreds of court records by now, what is of course predominant is denial, is obfuscation, is whitewashing, is watering down the reality of what had taken place. And here I was reading the most horrific, graphic descriptions of what a mass killing is really like by the people who had committed the mass killing. And it clearly wasn't coming from just one or two men, but was coming from a number of the witnesses who were being quoted in the indictment. So I made the decision that I would have to go to the city of Hamburg, where the trial of Police Battalion 101 took place, what happened after the indictment, and to look at the entire court records of this event, if I was going to use this test case to explore issues of choice and to explore this extremely, seemingly much more truthful account of what a killer unit actually does. I went to Hamburg, and it was very clear one reason why I had this kind of unusual testimony was that in this case, very rare case, the entire roster of the killing unit had survived the war. And because this was a unit like a National Guard unit, almost all the members of the unit came from Hamburg or the surrounding area, that of the 500 men in the unit, 210 of them had been interrogated by the investigators for the trial in the post-war period. I had an over 40% return. And that most of them were rank and file who were not interested in lying for their officers. Most of the trials of killing units in Germany up until that point, they knew who the officers were, and the officers simply lied for one another. And so you had this conspiracy of exculpation in which everybody agreed on how they would cover up what the battalion had actually done. They would lie for each other. And now I had a massive testimony by rank and file who weren't interested in lying for their officers and were actually saying what had taken place. So this was why the book could be written. The particular unit was one in which the major had made explicit the issue of choice, and the investigators were able to interrogate 210 out of 500 men, which gave me an evidentiary base simply that had no parallel in any previous trial of killing units. I went through the 30 volumes of testimony of these 210 men and came to conclusions as I sort of tried to work this into a book, to a single narrative that would incorporate all of these multiple accounts and multiple perspectives. And these sort of the basic conclusions of the book I can come through very quickly. One is that the choice that the major gave on the first day was not a one-time offer. This remained a standing offer, the standing policy of the battalion throughout its time in Poland, not only on that first day, but at no point during its stay in Poland could any officer coerce one of his men into killing, because they knew they were covered by the major, who had made clear that people who didn't feel up to killing were not to be forced to kill. So that the importance of his initial offer was that, in fact, it remained as the standing policy of the entire battalion throughout the war. Secondly, the men in the battalion represented a particular slice of German society. That is, they were middle-aged. They were not eligible to be conscripted until 1941, late 41, when by then Germany is, of course, involved in the war in Russia. The manpower pool for drafting people is hitting bottom. So they extend the age of people who can be conscripted for some kind of wartime service from 35 years old to 48 years old. And this is why the average age of the battalion is 39 and a half in 1942. People who had not been eligible for conscription until late 41 are the group out of which virtually all the rank and file are drawn, so that they are men very close to 40 years old in their average age among the rank and file. The army was not interested in these people, and so they are sent to the order place. They're sent to a group of sort of, as I said, a kind of National Guard unit that presumably will do occupation duty far behind the lines, not frontline service. So it's not assumed that they have to be crack soldiers capable of great physical exertion, that they would have rather softer duty, and hence something that 40-year-olds could do. Most of them were people who had no exemption for being economically essential to the war economy, which meant that most of them were basically unskilled working class. They were people who drove trucks or worked in warehouses or were stevedores in the shipyards or were waiters in restaurants or were clerks in stores. People that they weren't going to draft and send to Poland people who were skilled technicians making submarines in Hamburg. They were going to send unskilled workers who were dispensable and not necessary for the war economy. So most of them were working class. Almost all of them had left school at the age of 14. They had not had even what we would call a high school, much less a college education. Coming from Hamburg, they came from a city that the Nazis had had trouble penetrating. The socialist and communist parties and the labor union movement had been strong in Hamburg. The Nazis had referred to it derisively as Red Hamburg. Thus, I think we can say that in terms of the men in 101, they're not just a cross-section of German society. If you were trying to stack the deck and trying to select a group of men least likely to become killers for Hitler, you would have wanted to take people about 40 years old, too old to have been veterans in World War I and experienced trench warfare and the brutality of World War I, or too young, I should say, and too old to have been raised in the Nazi socialization process. These people went to school in the 20s. They were not part of the Hitler Youth, not part of the Nazi curriculum in schools. They were raised, their formative period is that period of Weimar democracy between the end of World War I and the onset of the Nazi dictatorship. You would have wanted to get people from working class background, because basically this was the group that was least susceptible to Nazi appeals. The socialist and communist parties lost the fewest amount of votes to the Nazis, while most of the other political parties, the Nazis just vacuumed up in their rise to power. And you would have chosen them to come from a city like Hamburg, which was a relatively un-Nazified city, at least up until the mid-1930s. So a group of 40-year-old men from working class background from Hamburg, as I say, was a group of people least likely to become Nazi killers. A third conclusion I came to was that in their after their first experience of mass killing. The first massacre was at Józefów on July 13th, 1942. The reaction to this was trauma. They were distraught. They were upset. Nobody had prepared them for this. Having been drafted in late 41 and 42, they had very little training, very little indoctrination, and then they were sent off to Poland willy-nilly, and were totally unprepared for becoming the enforcers of Nazi racial policy in Poland. And to start that out with a massacre of the kind at Józefów was something that nothing had prepared them for, and initially they were, as I say, very traumatized and distraught and upset about it. Very few men accepted the major's option to opt out, but that didn't mean that they were not very highly affected by what they had, in effect, chosen to do. Over time, however, that changed. One of the most disturbing discoveries was how quickly people got used to doing things that initially traumatized them. That as the killings and deportation acts continued through the summer and fall of 1942, very quickly the men became habituated to it. It became routine. And I would say that the unit basically split into roughly 3 groups. One group I dubbed the eager killers. These are people that quite simply learn to enjoy killing other human beings, the opportunity to kill with impunity. In fact, they got intoxicated on, they got high on, they learned to enjoy it, they volunteered for it, and having spent the morning killing, they could come back to camp, have a good lunch, and joke about what they had done, and boast about what they had done. So there is a group, a minority, but an important minority within the battalion that become eager killers. There is a larger group, I think the largest group, that were the accommodators. Those that went along with the orders and policies of the battalion. They didn't seek out chances to kill, but they never refused and didn't take up the major's offer to them, take the initiative to excuse themselves if they were assigned to a firing squad or a ghetto clearing unit or whatever. And they just simply found it easier to go along to get along, and did as they were asked to do. There was a third group that I call the evaders, and they did take up over time the major's officer. On the first day, very few men stepped out in front of their comrades, about 10 or a dozen. But others, over the course of the day, would go privately to their non-commissioned officer and say, please let me out. Or they would simply shirk and slip off and hide rather than be around when the corporal is rounding up his platoon to send to the forest or whatever. So certainly the number of non-shooters was much higher in the first day than those that publicly availed themselves of the major's offer. And that group grew over time. So there was a significant minority. I, at the time, estimated 10 to 20%. I think it could have even been higher, but probably certainly much more likely close to the 20% than the lower 10% that I had first estimated when I wrote the book, who choose not to take part in the actual killing. That is, they don't want to pull the trigger and blow somebody's head apart at point blank range and be soaked in the blood and brain matter of the man that they have just executed. It does not mean that they don't take part at all. In fact, they would continue to take part in the roundups, the ghetto clearings, and do everything short of actually pulling the trigger, so that they continue to enable the battalion to function as a killing unit, even if they evaded the particular task of pulling the trigger and being the last in the chain of people who made the killing possible. In terms of those that evaded, for the most part, they didn't say, in fact, almost entirely, they did not say they couldn't do it because it was wrong. They didn't say that I morally object or the regime is immoral. The standard way in which one exercised the major's option not to take part was to say, I am too weak, or I have children, or indicate in some way that that you are too sensitive to carry out this grisly but manly task. And of course, perniciously, what that did was validate the stance of the people who did kill. They were strong. The people that didn't kill were weak. The men who killed were manly. The men who didn't kill were womanly. They even used that term. They gendered, in a sense, what they were doing in those terms. So the way in which people opted to not shoot was not to challenge the regime, not to criticize their comrades, but to, in effect, praise and validate their comrades as being tough enough to do this very unpleasant task, which they themselves were too weak to do. And that carved out the space that allowed them to get out of pulling the trigger, but not to alienate themselves from, isolate themselves from their comrades. And of course, this is an occupation unit in a foreign country. You're a hostile occupying force. The only social group you have is the 500 men of your unit. And ostracism is a very serious sanction for someone who can look forward to several years in Poland. And the last thing you want to do is be scorned and ridiculed and rejected by your comrades. What kind of life are you going to have if your own comrades turn on you? You certainly have nowhere else to turn. So the pressure, in a sense, to exercise the option not to kill had to be done in this very careful way in which you didn't blame the people who killed. You took the blame upon yourself for being too weak to do what others were doing. Having sort of come to those conclusions, since I wrote all the book except the last chapter, and at that point I said, well, I need more. I need something that will give me more insight into the larger questions that the men themselves can't comment on and aren't even, in a sense, really conscious of. And that basically was the key question of why did the men do it? Why did they not take up the major's option? And in particular, why did they do things as a member of a battalion, as a member of a group that they never would have done on their own as an individual? That led me to think that the answer I needed was not to look at individual psychology, not to look at these men as psychologically abnormal, which is what had been the standard approach to notorious Nazi killers. This approach had been, well, that's not what normal people do. There must be something in their psychology that's abnormal. The tool we must bring to understand the people that kill is abnormal psychology. What's wrong with those people? Where do they differ from us? We couldn't do that. They must be different in some fundamental part of their psychological makeup. Or alternatively, their makeup is different because they're from a different culture. Germans do that. Nobody else but Germans would do that. And both of these mechanisms were distancing mechanisms. We didn't have to confront the fact that, in fact, maybe we could do that. Maybe this, in fact, was not done by abnormal people or an abnormal culture, but by what I later called ordinary men. And for me, then, the discipline I turned to was not individuals, was not abnormal psychology, but social psychology. The study of how people interact in groups and how being in a group affects and changes the way people act from how they would have acted as individuals. And I was fortunate there were a series of experiments by social psychologists in the late 1950s and the early 60s that looked at three things that became key for me. One was the Solomon Asch experiments in conformity and the power of the desire to conform, to not stand out as an outsider, as an isolated sort of element, and how that would shape and get people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. The Milgram experiments of Stanley Milgram that basically dealt with deference to authority, the degree to which even if there's something we don't want to do, if an authority figure that we value and stands for things that we accept, orders us to do it, we'll defer to that authority, and that in groups the authority figure, of course, can hold great sway. And finally, the Zimbardo prison experiment, Stanley Zimbardo's work on role adaptation. If you put somebody in a military uniform or a prison guard uniform or a police uniform, they, in a sense, adapt to the expectations of what people think a good soldier, a good prison guard, a good policeman is supposed to do. And so they become different from who they were before. They adapt to the new role that they have taken on. And I found that all three of those concepts, role adaptation, deference to authority, conformity to the group, were powerful factors in everyday life in which we live in groups, and that they were magnified in their impact, intensified because of the greater intensity of the group dynamic for a small occupation unit, isolated from the rest of society, living among an entirely hostile population in which your 500 comrades are the only social world that you have. They are the only group you have. You can't turn to family, you can't turn to girlfriend, you can't turn to classmates, you can't turn to your pastor. That this is the world you have, and it's the one in which you have to keep up whatever social ties you are going to have. So that my argument was that, in fact, these factors of social psychological group dynamic were intensified within the unit in the context of an occupation unit in Poland, in which authority and conformity and role adaptation all lent themselves to carrying out killing in the context of Nazi Germany. The last thing I had sort of settled on was the title. And at that point, the title was not at all self-evident. I, in fact, proposed to my publisher the title Becoming Killers. This we're looking at is the process by which people are transformed into killers. He said you can't use that title because becoming in English has, in a sense, two meanings. Becoming as changing over time, and becoming as handsome, attractive, a becoming young gentleman, and so forth. He says, you know, if someone can misunderstand something, they will misunderstand something. So we should just simply preempt whatever confusion that might occur there, and he vetoed that title. James Waller later used that title and it worked just fine, but I was forced to pass on it by my editor. And fortunately, that was a good thing, because after about a month of kicking around various things, we finally settled on Ordinary Men. As I say, it wasn't self-evident at the time. Since then, it's become kind of a cliche. And you'll find ordinary men in quotes in lots of different contexts. As I say, it's become a cliche because, in fact, it was so apt. It was indeed just the right title for the book, and captured, I think, exactly what I was trying to argue. The book came out in 1992, mostly received favorable review. But there were a number of critiques or responses that I think raised serious questions, and either prodded additional research, because they were questions we couldn't answer with what we knew in 1992, or at least forced us to define our terms more carefully, to reconceptualize, because this was a book, in a sense, entering a field that didn't exist. And it was the beginning of a discussion. And certainly for me as an author, to spark what becomes a major discussion is very gratifying, but you have to accept that it's not the last word. The first word is never going to be the last word. And so the question is, what have been the various developments since then? What were the criticisms that I think led to the greatest insights and to progress in our understanding? And so what I'd like to go through is just at least three of a number of different topics that were debated in the 1990s. One challenge to the book was the title, and it said, were these men ideological warriors or ordinary men? Were they typical? Can you take Reserve Police Battalion 101, made out of this particular group of men that we had discussed, and generalize them to explain Nazi mass murder? Or are they so unusual and so qualified into a particular case that, in fact, most Nazi killers are irrelevant to this approach, and that this does not speak to the wider question of how was it the Nazis found the manpower to carry out the final solution? And the answer initially was in 1992, we don't know whether this was a typical police battalion because it's the first police battalion we had studied in detail. And so we had no way to compare. Over the next 10 years, and one of the important developments the book spurred was studies of a whole raft of other police battalions, and to learn a whole much more about this whole institution of the order police that had been basically under the radar until then, but it turns out to have been one of the major manpower sources for the final solution. And now we know a great deal more, and we can answer that question of how typical Reserve Police Battalion 101 was. And I would answer twofold. One, it was not typical, but secondly, it still is utterly relevant to the issue of understanding the Holocaust, and let me explain that. Once we had known more about the battalions, and there were over 100 of them, they basically broke into three groups. One cluster of police battalions were made up of men who, in the pre-war period, from 1937 to 1939, volunteered for the order police and were reserve policemen. That is, they went to training on weekends and summer camps, much like the National Guard, where they did receive training, they did receive indoctrination. They were mobilized into battalion-sized units in 1939 when war broke out, given yet additional training and indoctrination. By now, they were usually men in their early 30s, that they were then sent out to occupied territory where they got experience in enforcing Nazi occupation policy, short of mass murder. The final solution is not underway yet. And so by the time they are sent into Russia in 1941 to be a major manpower source for the vast mass murders alongside the Einsatzgruppen, they have had behind them 4 years of training and indoctrination and 2 years of occupation experience. This is utterly different than from 40-year-old men being slapped together in Hamburg with little training or indoctrination and shipped off to Poland and told to start shooting. A second group were younger and more elite yet. These men were in the so-called 300 level battalions. Most of the battalions were starting with 1 through 100 and something, 135, whatever, were the first type I described. And then there were the 300 to 323 battalions, and they were made up of people that had volunteered for the SS, but were made available instead to the order police. And it came about this way. When the war breaks out, Heinrich Himmler goes to the order police and says, I need a bunch of your experienced professional policemen so I can make, or so, I'm sorry, the army goes to the order police and says, we need a bunch of people who are experienced policemen. And if you will transfer a large number of your professional police to the army to become MPs, then you may draft out of a pool of volunteers whoever you want to select. So this can be a highly elite select group to bring into the order police men in their mid to late 20s and form those into elite police battalions. So the 300 level people are put into the order police in 39. Once again, they are younger, they are much more Nazified, much higher level of Nazi membership, party membership. Many of them go on to use their police experience to volunteer for the SS, and that they have intensive training, intensive indoctrination, and again, experience in occupied territories before they begin killing in Russia in 1941. Then there's the group like Reserve Police Battalion 101, who are now filled up with men in their late 30s, early 40s, have no time for indoctrination, no time for training, thrown together and sent into Poland in this case, and sent off to kill with very little preparation. So they're utterly non-elite. They are not any more members of the Nazi Party than the average population, and yet they become killers. So in that regard, Police Pen 101 is atypical of most, but not all, battalions in the order police. But the scary thing is, and why I say this is still highly relevant to understanding our study of the Holocaust, is that once we knew more about these battalions, we can rank them by their murder scores, their body counts. And of the more than 100 battalions that are engaged in killing Jews in World War II, Reserve Police Battalion 101, though it starts a year later, doesn't start until the summer of 42, when others were sent off to Russia in 41. And despite the fact that it had very little indoctrination, very little training, composed of middle-aged duffers around 40 instead of younger men, was the fourth most lethal police battalion in the Third Reich. That they caught and passed in their killing virtually every other battalion in the order police except 3. To me, that's even scarier than if they were typical. It is their atypicality, in fact, that makes them so scary. You don't need special selection. You don't need a long period of indoctrination. You don't need members who are highly Nazified. You don't need people who are exposed to a long period of brutalization and occupation in order to create a killing unit. You can yank people off the streets of Hamburg who are middle-aged working class people, send them to Poland with a gun and tell them to shoot, and they can become one of the most deadly police battalions in the entire Third Reich. So my answer then to that question, finally, are they typical or not? I say they weren't typical, but that's even scarier. The whole notion of what ordinary men can do is intensified by what an atypical unit of such men is capable of in comparison to its rivals or its fellow other police battalions. The second criticism that was made regards the claim that I had ignored anti-Semitism and ideology as motivational factors. And I think that was came about a bit because I was positioned that way a bit because the book was challenged above all by Daniel Goldhagen in 1996 in his book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, in which he basically argued the sole sufficient and necessary explanation for why these men did what they did was they were products of German culture and were therefore carriers of a unique German eliminationist anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism of this kind was the sole sufficient and necessary explanation for why these men killed. And since he was criticizing my book, then his was the ideological cultural explanation, and mine got positioned as the situational institutional explanation. And even though I hadn't ignored anti-Semitism, in comparison to Goldhagen, many people felt that I did. I think the most constructive response to that false binary that said either you have an institutional, organizational, situational explanation, or you have a cultural, anthropological, ideological explanation, was the response of Leonard Newman, a social psychologist from Chicago. And when she said that is a false binary, you can't separate the two. That people who are in a situation, such as the men in Poland as an occupation force, read the situation they are in through the cultural and ideological lenses that they wear. Situations are not fixed and the same for everyone. In fact, you construct the situation you are in, and different people in the same situation will understand that situation differently. And that you do have to take into account cultural assumptions by Germans when they come to Poland about Poles and Jews, to understand why they acted in a way, for instance, that Italians did not act when they are sent to occupy southern Greece or the coast of Yugoslavia, and that that the two simply are so intertwined that you cannot talk about either or. That in fact, how men behave is inextricably going to be a combination of the cultural assumptions they bring to bear and the situational factors that they then understand, construct through the lenses that they are, of the cultural glasses in a sense that they are wearing. A third objection was particularly put forward by Daniel Goldhagen, that I had simply been duped and fooled by the policeman's testimony. That these were men being investigated for possibility of being brought to trial, that they lied pervasively, that they gave exculpatory accounts, and that he set up the rule in effect that I will only take the testimony that has no potential to be self-exculpatory, and everything else I will rule out because I'm not going to write a history in which some Nazi fools me. And so he took a very purist view that he would only use certain testimonies, and the bulk of it he would rule in a sense as invalid or potentially invalid. Now, when I looked at the testimony, I felt, in fact, these testimonies were a spectrum, and that at one end of the spectrum, testimonies were so mendacious that neither he nor I would ever dream of using them, that these people are so transparently lying that you don't pay any attention to them. There were testimonies at the other end of the spectrum that are so self-incriminating, so confessional, that there's no way that these people are incriminating themselves falsely, and that both he and I would use those testimonies. But then there's a middle band of testimony that is telling most of the truth most of the time, but not all of the truth all of the time. And most of in those cases, they are telling the truth about what the battalion did, even if they are not telling all of the truth about what they personally and individually did. That is, they're not lying about the history of the battalion, and they're giving us all sorts of very valuable information about the history of the battalion, even if they are whitewashing and diluting their own role and their own personal actions. To me, that's invaluable historical information, and I included it in my book. Goldhagen does not want to use it because he considers them tainted. Now, that's why my portrayal of the men comes out as a spectrum of behavior, and his comes out as all of these guys were eager killers. If you take the testimonies only of the self-confessed eager killers, what else can you do but to come up with a portrayal of the battalion as composed of eager killers? It is a false methodology in which you so limit the evidence that it can do no other than confirm the hypothesis the emphasis is designed to test. Because the only evidence allowed in is that doesn't contradict the hypothesis you're beginning with, which is namely the Germans are all motivated by eliminationist anti-Semitism. So we had a methodological difference, and the result was we had very different uses of the evidence and very different portrayals of the battalion. I think subsequent research has most people siding with me as opposed to the very purist exclusionary approach of Goldhagen, but you can read both and make up your own mind. Where have things gone since then? I realize we're running out of time, so let me focus just on sort of one historian that has made two contributions that I think are really very important. And this is Thomas Kuhne of Clark University. And one thing he argued, I think very importantly, was that in looking at motivation, and particularly even cultural and ideological factors behind motivation, we have to go beyond our singular and sole focus on anti-Semitism and look at what other factors had resonance that the Nazis could harness to mobilize people to carry out killing, even if those factors were not explicitly part of anti-Semitism. That is, you can turn people into anti-Semitic killers by mobilizing them on the basis of something other than anti-Semitism or in addition to anti-Semitism. And he wrote two books on two broad concepts within German society that had broad resonance, that had broad appeal, that the Nazis managed to appropriate effectively and use to mobilize people. And one of these was the concept of Folksgemeinschaft. Folksgemeinschaft can be translated, it's one of those German words that has no English equivalent. It can be translated as the people's community, the folks community. And under the Nazis, I say the right translation is the racial community. Initially, the concept was very broad and inclusionary. it really has its origins in terms of having broad resonance in German society, when at the beginning of World War I, the Kaiser gives his speech in the first days of August as the war is breaking out, that he now knows only Germans. He doesn't know classes, confessions, political divisions. He knows only Germans. Everybody should be united in this. All of Germany is now a people's community. And for Germans who had been in a very class divided, ridden society, a highly tense divisions of German society, this was quite intoxicating. And then of course, it is then becomes in a sense the community of the trench in World War I. So for Germans, it had a very positive resonance. What the Nazis were able to do after the war, when they come to power, is basically turn an inclusionary notion of people's community into an exclusionary notion of the racial community, in which everybody who doesn't count as the good pure Aryan is out. So the asocials are out, and the Jews are out, and the Roma and Sinti are out, and the homosexuals are out, and the communists are out. And so that it is a community that is based ever more on what you are not, and who gets excluded. But it still kept the resonance that it had before. That was the trick they managed to play, is that the unity that they were able to, in a sense of unity, create among Germans on the basis of the Folksgemeinschaft, was part of what kept, in a sense, was what Hitler's built much of the power of the Third Reich on. The second was that Kuhne wrote about was comradeship. And of course, here again, he goes back to World War I. I assume most of you have read All Quiet on the Western Front, which was, of course, quite the opposite of the Nazis. It's a anti-war book that is a pacifist in a sense in his final arguments. But if you remember in that, the hero of the story says, the only good thing coming out of this war is the comradeship that we feel among ourselves. And ultimately, of course, when he's in the trench with the dying Frenchman, even comradeship with a fellow soldier across the side who was an equal victim of the war. That the war was victimizing trench soldiers on all sides, and there was a comradeship of the victims. For the Nazis, of course, that's not the case. The comradeship is again to be a racial comradeship, and the power of the term comradeship is expropriated and turned into an exclusionary rather than a universal concept. And much Nazi propaganda is based again on this power of comradeship. So for Kuhne, he's arguing much of what mobilized Germans enabled Hitler to, in a sense, give them a sense of unity and idealism were the residents they were able to do by appropriating comradeship and Folksgemeinschaft. The Nazis not only were based on their antis, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, anti-communist, anti-democratic, anti-whatever, but also the positives, that they were the exemplar of Folksgemeinschaft and comradeship. The other thing that Kuhne was able, I think, to articulate very well was, in a sense, the inversion of the morality that the Nazis were able to accomplish. What he calls the morality of immorality. And let me try to explain that. And the case I will use is very important because it's an example that involves neither the SS, but the German army as the perpetrator, and not Jews as the victims, but Serbian civilians. So this was, again, an inversion of morality that enabled the Nazis to commit all sorts of atrocities apart from anti-Semitism. In the summer of 1941, after the Germans had occupied Yugoslavia, they partitioned the country, fragmented it, and Serbia was turned into a military occupation zone under the German army. That triggered a resistance, above all by Tito and the partisans, the communists. And the Nazi response was to punish the Serbs with ever-intensifying reprisal policies. Ultimately, for every German soldier killed, 100 civilians could be rounded up and executed in order to deter through terror any resistance. This policy of terror through reprisal was gaining speed in September of 1941, when a new field marshal, a new general, man named Franz Burma, is sent there with reinforcements to carry out what was called a punishment expedition. And Burma gives the orders for this punishment expedition. And he says the goal was, quote, to hit the whole population most severely. In short, you're erasing any notion of distinction between civilian and combatant, that all Serbs, men, women, children, are to be punished for this uprising. And then he goes on to exhort his troops about who might not want to participate in this kind of bloodbath. And he says, quote, anyone who wishes to rule charitably sins against the lives of his comrades. Here wants to get comradeship, but even more importantly, we get a moral inversion. In this case, what he's basically saying that is to not want to kill unarmed civilians is a sin. And the moral duty, the morality, is to kill these people with utmost severity because that's what you owe your comrades. Moral duty is only to your comrades. All other human beings on earth are outside the moral circle of human obligation, and that you inverted this what this term, the community, the morality of immorality of Kuna, I think captures this moral inversion. And when you can, in fact, get people to buy into that moral inversion, where killing everyone else is a moral duty, and not to kill everybody else is a sin against your comrades, you've created a world in which anything, including the Holocaust, is possible. With that, I will end, but thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Browning. That was very, very interesting. Again, for those of you still with us at the webinar, you can obviously write in your questions either in the Q&A or using the chat function on the webinar. We do have a few minutes for questions, and we did get a couple, Dr. Browning, while you were speaking. First, and you almost just touched on this right now, but the question is, or kind of a statement and a question. It says, one of the parts of your book that struck me the most was how these battalion members were given the opportunity to not participate in the war crimes, yet most chose to move forward with the murders. To me, this is where they move from bystanders to perpetrators. What do you hope we take away from the fact and act of inhumanity as wars continue and everyday people are put in positions of power?
Yeah, I've been an educator my whole life, so I have some faith in the power of education. And one reason I write a book like this, one reason we study the Holocaust, is that we'll become aware of and conscious of the possibility of being placed in these kind of dilemmas. So we're not caught by surprise when we do. That in a sense, we have already scripted ourselves to know how to react. One of the most gratifying aspects of the book is that, in fact, all the military academies, Air Force, Navy, and Army, have at one point used the book. So people there that chose to assign it, obviously, like myself, hope that this, in a sense, equips people to be more conscious of what decisions they might face, to not, in a sense, I mean, if your initial stance is only Germans do this or only sick people do this, normal people don't, when suddenly you're in that position where you're asked and told to do this, you've got no defense or no preparation to how you're going to react. If you understand that people like yourselves did this, you can begin to contemplate about how you're going to react if and when ever such a horrible dilemma faces you. In that sense, raising consciousness, raising awareness, preparing people to understand that this kind of dilemma happens just because Germans were bad people or there were some crazy sadistic, monsters in Germany that did this, but that in fact, most organized genocidal killing is carried out by ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. Under the orders and policies of extraordinary governments. But we have to be prepared for that if, in fact, we're going to behave differently.
All right, great. A few more here that we have time. were people ostracized who proclaimed themselves as being weak? I apologize for the dog barking there, but if they were proclaimed weak, were they ostracized in any way?
They were ostracized less than if they had told their fellow comrades, "You're all murderers and killers," and doing a terrible thing. That would have gotten them probably not only ostracized, but in considerable trouble. Some of the men said yes. Well, they, in a sense, not necessarily from all of the men around them. Some of the officers scorned some of these men. They'd be assigned, peeling potatoes more often, given unpleasant other kinds of tasks because they weren't doing their fair share of the dirty work and killing people. So there was some harassment by some. I mean, some of the men complained, yes, I was ridiculed by some of my comrades. I was, some of my non-coms got on my back, but they would also then say, but not everybody. Others were very, were understood and were very fine with it. So there was some negative reaction, but not a total ostracizing. No one that was kind of silenced. Nobody would sit at their table, talk to them, completely write them off for, put them in solitary confinement for 2 years in effect. That didn't happen.
The question is, do you agree with the statement from Ben Friends that war makes mass murderers of otherwise good and decent people? Why or why not?
War most often offers the opportunity for genocide, but it is distinct from mass killing. Not all wars lead to mass killing, and sometimes we get mass killing without wars, but usually they're related, in part because, of course, almost all genocides are cast by the genocidal regime as self-defense. They're out to get us, and we have to defend ourselves. Perfect case of Rwanda, that it's the Tutsi invaders from the camps in Uganda that are coming to get us, so we have to kill all the Tutsis before they kill us. And Hitler, the Jewish world conspiracy wants to strangle Germany, suffocate it, destroy it, so we have to kill the Jewish threat. And why having to kill a 2-year-old Jewish baby in the Ukraine is somehow going to make Germany safer may be very bizarre. But if you buy into the whole ideological framing, that in fact is part of that framing. So war both basically gets people into the field, and where the self-defense lever, I might say, is most practical. And of course, you have the war as a front behind which lots of things can be done. Hitler doesn't begin, this until, in fact, Barbarossa, not even just the beginning of the war, but the major war in the Soviet Union is tied very closely to the launching of the final solution. So I would say, historically, I would say genocide and war are closely related, but they aren't absolutely necessary to be tied.
Sure. All right, we have time for a couple more questions, and I apologize we won't get to everybody's question, but this is one of the first questions we got in, and you may not be able to answer this one, but it says, in the past several months, a new documentary in Israel came out about the Eichmann lost tapes that were taken around 1957 while Eichmann was in hiding. The tapes were not allowed to be admitted at the Eichmann trials. Now that they are finally in the open, at least in Israel, not yet here in the United States, have the details in the tapes altered your perceptions or thoughts about him and or any of the other perpetrators in general?
I would have to, let me provide more information on that.
Sure.
It's correct that tapes were taken when Eichmann was talking to various Nazi groups in Argentina before he's captured. Life magazine, the man who took the tapes, Wilhelm Sassen, a Dutch Nazi journalist who organized these soirees that basically Eichmann spoke at, sold one version to Life magazine in 1960. Another version was given to Eichmann's widow, Vera, and a very doctored, whitewashed version prepared by the foremost Nazi defense lawyer of Nazi criminals in the post-war period, issued that as a kind of Eichmann biography. And we had some pages of transcript from those that were at the Eichmann trial, but the only pages that were allowed into evidence were the ones in which Eichmann had his own handwriting on them, correcting them. So some pages of the transcripts of the tapes were in, others they couldn't submit as evidence because Eichmann basically argued you have no proof that I saw them or that they represent what I said. So we knew of the tapes. We had bits of that information already. And then, of course, he gave a whole series of different accounts during the trial. The actual tapes themselves and the transcripts were collected from different places by the Bundesarchiv in the 1990s, and then finally have been made accessible to scholars in the late 90s and in the early this century. So we know that the snippets that we saw earlier are confirmed, and they do, I would say what they do is they challenge and disprove Hannah Arendt's contention that Eichmann is just the banal bureaucrat. That was his defense strategy, that he is a highly ideological, committed, and ambitious Nazi. That's what most biographies of Eichmann were already saying in the late 80s and the 90s. This simply gives us even more than we had before. So I would say those were a great corrective to Hannah Arendt's argument of Eichmann being an example of banality of evil, but most scholars had already, in a sense, correcting for that even before the current release of the tapes themselves. In this whole thing, I would say my view is that Arendt had the right concept, banality of evil, for people like 101, the ordinary men. Eichmann was not the right example. Eichmann passed that off as a defense strategy precisely because there were so many people like he was pretending to be. And that made it effective, but it was not historically, in fact, who he was. And we've been collecting evidence of that even before the final Argentine tapes got released. Now, even more definitively, we know that.
Oh, these are some great questions that are coming in. So I want to try to get to them real quick. Basically, I'm going to try to summarize a few of them. But basically, was there any element of patriotism for these actions for the battalion based on basically trying to restore the glory that they had lost in World War I? And then was this true kind of for police battalions outside of the Men of Hamburg? Or were they just kind of an outlier?
No, I mean, certainly the whole Nazi framing is that Germany is the victim.
Right.
Germany was stabbed in the back in World War I. The big lie of the 1920s to undermine the legitimacy of the Weimar Republic was that Germany had not lost the war on the battlefield. They had been destroyed by traitors in the home front, the communists, the Jews, the Democrats, who had then surrendered to the Allies, destroyed Germany, and set up this phony, un-German democracy, Weimar, and that therefore that had to be, overthrown. It was legitimate and patriotic to overthrow the Weimar Republic and to restore some form of authoritarian government. And this was Hitler's big lie. And he's very frank in Mein Kampf that you better tell big lies rather than small ones. And even if the lie itself is totally insane, if you repeat it enough, make it more of an emotional than intellectual appeal, and you just do it ceaselessly and consistently, lots of people will believe it. And of course, that's a lesson I think we have before our own eyes in American politics today. If I can intervene with an editorial comment,
well, that's kind of where the last question is similar to along those lines is. After you've done the study of this and the Holocaust, have you been able to draw parallels between other genocides in the modern era and obviously any themes that are happening in today's world, which I think you just answered that question. But
yeah, in a sense, those are two questions. One is, can we draw lessons about the failure of German democracy, and can we draw lessons about genocide? For me, the Holocaust is a particularly important historical topic because it's the most extreme, most thorough genocide carried out by the most scientifically and bureaucratically and economically advanced country that has committed genocide so far. Genocide is not the product of a primitive nation. It's not a resurgence of barbarism. It is German scientists that helped design, the use of gas. That is German engineers that built the railway system that brought people from all over Europe. This is a modern genocide. So we can't sort of think this is something we put behind us. The more modern and the more developed we are, the safer we are. That doesn't hold when you look at the Holocaust. So it's important that we don't sort of say, well, Holocausts are what primitive Africans do in Rwanda or Cambodians do under Pol Pot, because this is a European genocide. This is a genocide within Western civilization. So that's to the question of how the Holocaust stacks up with in relation to other genocides. In terms of the collapse of the Weimar Republic under the Nazi threat, I would say, I would just take us through the following 4 stages. The first is the big lie to delegitimize German democracy. The second was the attempted putsch in 1923 when Hitler storms Munich trying to overthrow the government there in the hope this would set a chain reaction that would lead to the collapse of Weimar. It didn't work. Hitler is put on trial. He is convicted, but a sympathetic conservative judiciary basically gives him a token sentence. He sits in Landsberg for 13 months, getting fat and having 350 visitors. He's holding court. What they did not do is to expel Hitler as an Austrian citizen convicted of a felony in Germany and throw him out of the country, end of Hitler forever. They had the chance to get rid of him, but he's a good right-wing German patriot. We can use him. He's on our side. The fourth step was what Hitler then said, okay, putsches, violent insurrections don't work in a modern era. So we need a, quote, legal, we need a tactics of legality. We need to come to power legally, and then we carry out the revolution, destroying democracy from within. And so the last years of the 20s and the early 30s is Hitler's ability to use the vulnerabilities and the weaknesses of the Constitution to subvert democratic norms, to exploit the unanticipated aspects of the Constitution that assume, for instance, emergency powers given to the Constitution to protect it can be used by an anti-democratic president to destroy the Constitution instead. And to me, the legal revolution is a very scary phenomenon because, one, it allows the people attacking the democracy to do it with impunity. And once in power, of course, then to oppose the destruction of democracy, you have to be outside the law. Hitler comes into power. One of the first things he does is they deputize 50,000 SA men. The thugs are the police, and the people opposing them are the criminals. You get an inversion, like the moral inversion we just talked about. You get an inversion of legitimate authority and revolutionary authority under the veneer and guise that all of this is legal. And it is technically, if you control the courts or have sympathetic courts, if you control some legislatures that allow you, or you have a president above all in their case, who uses the emergency powers granted him in the Constitution to subvert that Constitution. So yes, I think there's some very ominous lessons about the fall of Weimar for our current situation.
Yes, and well, I can't thank you enough. And I can, just based on the number of questions that we received, can tell that it was a very compelling presentation, and there are themes and ideas that are still very relevant in today's world, as we know. So again, I thank you for your time tonight or this afternoon from where you're at, and appreciate you being the first speaker for this series this fall. And I just want to pass along before I end up that we do have another speaker coming up this Thursday, September 15th. Hopefully you might be, I don't know if you can see that or not, but we will have part of our Be the Change speaker series, which is sponsored in part by the Spungen Family Foundation. And so Thursday, we have Dr. Nancy Siegel presenting twin study abuses, which for those of you who don't know, our museum, Candles Holocaust Museum, was founded by a twin, Eva Kor, and her and her sister went through Auschwitz and survived some experiments by Dr. Mengele. So looking forward to hearing from Dr. Siegel on Thursday. And again, if you'd like to sign up, you can go to our website at candlesholocaustmuseum.org and see the list there and be able to sign up. You will also be able to see this webinar early next week. We will have it up on our website, the recording of that. So again, Dr. Browning, I thank you. Have a pleasant evening and a wonderful weekend. And hopefully we will talk to you soon. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.